In this section, we'll talk about performance monitoring best practices. I'll emphasize which tool is appropriate to use and some performance counter threshold rules of thumb. So when you're analyzing performance issues, you'll want to get a quick cursory glance of performance with the Task Manager and Resource Monitor. These tools are ideally situated for interactive viewing of the current performance on the system. You can utilize Perfmon and PAL for a more detailed analysis, collecting data potentially in the background. You'll want to utilize a shorter sampling interval, say 5 seconds. This will allow you to get much finer granularity of what may be leading up to any performance issue. Finally, only use the Windows Performance Toolkit if absolutely necessary. As you may know, this tool is much more invasive than the other tools I've mentioned, in that it will potentially affect your system performance just by virtue of utilizing the tool. So, as you may know, there's literally hundreds of Perfmon counters. So how do you know which ones are important to look at and their corresponding thresholds? Well, let's take a moment to just review some of these key CPU metrics and their corresponding thresholds. We'll start out with the processor information, namely the processor time. When it reaches 50%, that's the warning level. When it reaches 80%, that is a critical saturation level, where it may be time to add more processors or enable hyperthreading. There's other counters such as privilege time that you don't want to let grow above the thresholds you see, or interrupt time. There's DPC time for those deferred procedure calls that you want to avoid getting too much overhead also. There's then the system context switches, and finally the number of threads that are queued up waiting for a particular processor. If you have more than 2 threads ready, or in the critical level of 10 threads ready, you've definitely got a processor issue. So there's also key memory metrics and their thresholds. For example, available megabytes. When we reach less than 5% of RAM, then, well, it's maybe time to add more memory. You also have various things like free system page table entries, your non-paged pool bytes, paged pool, and more importantly, your page file utilization. You never want to get more than, say, 50% used on a busy system. You can see here, if you're greater than 90% used, things come to an absolute crawl. There's other things depending on what applications you're running, such as the handle count or thread count. And then there's the memory-related private bytes they process using and its corresponding working set. So these are the key memory metrics and their thresholds. Finally, you'll want to look at the various disk metrics and their thresholds. As you can see here, there's a variety of them, from the logical disk average disk per second transfers, which you want to always keep under 15 milliseconds. You also have the average disk per second reads and writes. Again, keep them under 15 milliseconds if you can. If you're not accomplishing this, then you may need to add more disk drives to your RAID sets. You'll always want to keep plenty of free room on your system disk and avoid getting a disk queue length of greater than 2. Finally, depending on your applications, you'll want to keep an eye on your I/O data operations per second. Finally, as you've learned, some problems are very intermittent in nature and require special strategies to troubleshoot. You'll remember the Event ID triggers and action routines from the module on using advanced troubleshooting techniques. This can be very helpful if you're troubleshooting an issue that's associated with an Event ID. You'll also remember how you can establish an alert that triggers when a particular Perfmon threshold is reached. This can be very helpful for those intermittent performance issues that can crop up.